Thank you, Representative Schweikert, for meeting with us today. I want to start off with sort of a big picture question. The Republicans are in position to take back the House in 2022. What is the agenda if they do?
I think actually a lot of that is still being put together. There's actually a fairly disciplined process going on right now where they've broken up a lot of the policy areas. Over here is a health group, over here is an economic growth group, a security group. And for months now, they've been having members get together, they've been bringing in experts, reading the literature. So I think there's a much more disciplined, systematic process being taken than what we've seen in the past, and I'm going to accuse the left of having done, where they built part of the agenda by doing a poll. Instead, this one's been more doing it a little bit more member input and academically.
And could you give us a little preview of what some of maybe the key points that they've been working on?
For what I've worked on, it's, I obviously being Ways and Means, we do much more economic. A personal belief that growth is moral, that it lifts the poor, it lifts the working poor. It's a much more elegant solution for society is when you have growth, and so that's what we've been focusing on. Are there things you could do in the tax code, the regulatory code, trade, that would create sustainable economic expansion?
And what is the agenda if you don't manage to take back the House?
If we're not blessed to take back the majority, then a lot of what we do right now is trying to point out that the current left agenda sounds wonderful. It has such great marketing, but the actual math underlying really is hurting people. The working poor got substantially poorer last year. Many of the proposals the Democrats are moving forward, you actually get the literature and you start to dig through it, and by the end of the decade, much of the middle class is poor. Sounds great, good politics, may get you reelected, but it's crappy economics.
And you've talked a lot about sort of the debt and the economics. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on what the solution to our debt is. Debt has just reached $30 trillion. Yeah. How do we start to bring that back down?
Yeah, what stunned me is, think of that, we crossed $30 trillion and was barely a bleep of news. I think a cat video probably had more people paying attention to it than the fact we crossed $30 trillion of borrowed money. The old folklore of, well, you're going to do entitlement reform, or the, a partisan folklore for the left that, hey, it's defense, it's rich people not paying enough, or for conservatives it was waste and fraud, or things of that nature, foreign aid. None of that's true. The fact of the matter is U.S. sovereign debt is driven by our demographics. And it's really difficult and makes people very upset when you tell them, but that's the truth. CBO last year projected in 29 years from now, $112 trillion of borrowed money in today's dollars. Functionally, 3/4 of that is just the shortfall in Medicare. The other quarter of it is the shortfall in Social Security. The rest of the budget's in balance. So the solution becomes something where you have to do lots of things all at the same time. You've got to grow the economy at an incredible rate. You've got to fix the immigration system so it fixates on economic growth. The regulatory system has to adopt technology that in a way where it's not a bureaucratic malaise, but it's a pro-growth malaise, a pro-growth focus. And then you have to do the really hard stuff. And there's armies of lobbyists here in Washington to stop it. And that is adopt technology that disrupts the price of healthcare. Because once again, the vast majority of the debt that we're piling on today is healthcare expenditures. There's a way to get there, but every solution has an army of lobbyists on the other side willing to stop it, or being paid to stop it.
I want to talk about those innovations that you're mentioning later, but I think for a lot of Americans, you hear $30 trillion of debt, but that doesn't really resonate. It's hard to understand what debt would mean for the average American, what it could mean. So could you explain how it will affect everyday Americans?
Well, first let's talk the fragility argument. And I know that's a little Talebish, but the concept of when you start to pile on this type of debt, we hit a point where just a couple point interest rate rise means every dime of revenues into the federal government goes just to pay interest. Trying to explain that when we say, hey, 29 years from now we have 112 trillion in debt, that doesn't even count this last year's worth of spending, because that's not in the calc. But it's also saying there's never another major recession. There's never a war. There's never another pandemic. We've made ourselves very fragile as a country in our economic, government's ability to respond economically. And that's really, really dangerous. But the other side is, I have a little girl. I have a 6-year-old daughter. The math says when she starts to get to her peak earning years, her tax rate will have to double from what it is today. So double today's tax rates just to maintain the most basic government services. I'm not sure there's an understanding of how fragile everyone's retirement is right now. There's often this quip saying, oh, that's my grandkid's problem. No, it's not. It's your problem. Some of the social entitlements, they're earned. You earned your Medicare. You earned your Social Security. That's part of the social contract. Those trust funds are gone in about a decade.
And you mentioned the interest payments, and you said that that's a big driver of this debt. I think that it could be 600 billion or something that people are paying off in debt annually. But some economists have said that the interest payment to GDP ratio, right now it's about 1.5%, so it's around what it's historically been. Are you concerned that that's going to increase past 3%, which has been the historical high? When
you actually see what the economists say is, because we've had suppressed interest rates now for years. So when you start to see some of the models, even here for 22, saying by fourth quarter, we may be back up to a 3% on the 10-year. You're starting to move back fairly quickly to historic interest rates. At that point, the suppression of interest rates argument goes away, and we're back having to deal with the reality of when you're carrying a $30 trillion debt, and by the end of this year it'll be 31. The pleasant math, the excuse for being able to spend starts to go away very quickly. And a lot of things you'd like to do as a society, you can't do because you're just paying the interest on your bonds. And a lot of folks don't understand how much gets rolled every month. Remember, it's not just the $47,000 we borrow every second. It's how much has to be refinanced, because a lot of the current debt rolls off, and it's going to constantly be rolled off and refinanced at the newer, higher interest rates.
So you said that cutting defense, cutting foreign aid, these things aren't going to do it alone.
They don't. They're rounding errors. It's a complete fraud, and we try over and over and over because we have to break a lot of the folklore that the political class, the reporter class, even the public think they know. When you start to look at the actual math, you could wipe out all foreign aid, and I think it pays a week or so's worth of the interest. I mean, it's just the scale we're borrowing at right now, and we've been blessed having a Federal Reserve that buys huge portions of the debt, even the MBS debt, the mortgage-backed. So we've had this interest rate suppression, but that's starting to come to an end because we've now seen the inflationary repercussions of it.
So what are the solutions? Because it seems like maybe too big of a problem to fix. So how can we start stabilizing it?
You have to do everything, and you got to do it now. That's one of the things that just enrages me about the political class here in Washington. Forgive me, media, because we chase shiny objects because that's easier to watch. It's a lot more fun than sitting there saying, okay, we need to go on a path that creates intense, baseline, sustainable growth, and then we have to do all these things to change our cost structure, particularly in the delivering of healthcare. And let me give you a simple example. Telehealth. Before the pandemic, telehealth was one of the most lobbied against sort of technologies you can imagine. You would have all sorts of folks who benefit from the current healthcare structure who would be here on Capitol Hill trying to stop the expansion of being able to use that phone of yours or the wearable or the thing you blow into to be able to manage parts of your own healthcare. Pandemic hit, we expanded telehealth. My legislation. The day the pandemic is over, that expansion of telehealth goes away. And we actually have people lobbying to make sure it goes away because it becomes about the money. And that's where Washington, D.C. needs to step up and say, are we going to allow disruptive technologies that make our lives healthier, better, and change the cost curve? Are we going to allow those to move forward? Are we going to allow there to be all sorts of barriers of, hey, this is against the law, this is reimbursement, hey, we're going to regulate this so it doesn't happen or slow it down? Washington, D.C. has become more of a protection racket, and it's a protection racket of sort of incumbent business models, healthcare delivery models, than the disruptions. So the reason I walk all through that is you got to do it all. We've done a number of floor speeches where there's about a half dozen major categories, and if you did them all at the same time, the math says you could stabilize the growth of debt. You don't pay it off. It still grows, but you stabilize it as a percentage of GDP. And the reality you get through the baby boomers, that demographic bubble.
So you sound a little worried that this technology innovation in healthcare will be stopped. I've spoken to someone who works at a biotech startup. They're measuring blood pressure through a phone. You can put your phone camera on your finger.
I'm experimenting with one on my wrist right now.
Just like that. Do you worry that these sort of technologies, which can be very helpful in preventing long-term and higher healthcare costs, are going to be shut out of the marketplace due to larger health firms, blocking legislation to support them?
I don't think it's that granular. I think it's actually, can I give you sort of the quick thought experiment? And this, so about 5 years ago, material science professor, we're talking to her from our office. She has developed this thing that you blow into and instantly tells you have the flu. It's like a flu kazoo. She couldn't get it financed to try to bring it to market. Why? Because a technology where I could blow into something, it tells me I have the flu, bounces off my phone, lets me know if my medical records saying I'm not allergic to this antiviral, and the algorithm orders the antiviral, and the drone or Lyft or whoever delivers the antiviral to me a couple hours later. That technology is functionally illegal. It's an algorithm writing a prescription. It's a pharmacy fulfilling a script from an algorithm. It's the Social Security Act. It says you will see a doctor. The reality of it is our current reimbursement codes, regulatory codes, licensing, state licensing, stop much of the innovation that could make our lives easier, but also keep us healthier and crash the price of healthcare. And it's very uncomfortable because a lot of it's almost the Blockbuster Video versus Netflix moment, except in this case, Blockbuster Video owns an army of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to stop the transition to the new technologies.
So do you think that the lobbying industry is hurting this progress? Do you think there's a way for Congress to break through the sort of... It's
not fair to say the lobbying industry. The lobbying industry is representative of the business structure. The business structure has, and it's more than just business. You got to understand, it's the bureaucracies, it's often the universities, it's the entire infrastructure. they're doing what's economically rational. They're defending their model. We in Congress should strip away the arrogance of somehow thinking we understand how the world should work and say we're going to allow, whether it be technology or do business deliveries or creativity, to flourish, and the one that provides the best price, the best service wins. And instead, we in Congress defend today's model, and we chat up a bunch saying, oh, we're willing to do tiny incremental things, instead of stepping back and saying, let the disruption happen. And maybe that's one of the things that also helps save us and saves us economically. 31% of Medicare spending is just diabetes. In that case, do everything you can, resource-wise and those things, to functionally cure diabetes. Not make it more manageable, cure it. We now know how to cure type 1. You know, the articles from in December, we had proof of concept on curing type 1. To cure type 2 would be the single biggest revolution you could have of one item to change U.S. sovereign debt. Approach it that way, instead of the heresy of saying, oh, we're going to do this small, we're going to cut back on entitlements to this population or this and that. None of that math works.
So how do you break through to Congress? Because not many people in Congress are speaking about innovation and these sort of strategies to handle our debt. How do you get both sides of Congress on board to such a radical change?
See, the problem is it's not radical. In other parts of our society, this happens all the time. I mean, think of the supercomputer you walk around with in your pocket. You know, the fact you go home and you stream your entertainment instead of going down to the local shopping center and get a silver disc to shove in your machine. It's a problem because Washington has become so siloed, where you work on agriculture issues and all you see is that. Over here you're doing financial products. Over here, you know, I do taxes and Medicare finance. And we don't have enough discussion of, you got to see the entire playing field. Here's what's happening to us demographically. You know, we're getting old very fast as a society. Here's some of the new cures. We now have a bunch of diseases we're about to cure. We need to move those cures forward as fast as possible, because curing, if over 50% of our healthcare spending is people with multiple chronic conditions, one of the most powerful things you could do for society and spending is cure a bunch of those chronic conditions. That should be almost the daily mantra of, we are going to help these technologies that cure people move forward. Oh, by the way, we get an amazing financial benefit from that. And yes, that's a very different mindset for a lot of the people here in Washington, which we know what we know, and we're often not incentivized or rewarded for trying to look forward. In many ways, you're battling last. You know, the last battle is what we talk about.
So the president has proposed spending $6.5 billion on ARPA-H, sort of a health-focused initiative, sort of like DARPA that invented the internet, to come up with some of these cures. Do you think that's a good initiative, or something like that could help?
It's a cornerstone, and even the last president, and even the president before that, you know, going back 3 administrations, have all talked about doing something similar. My objection to the model is, I think it needs to be much more freewheeling. Whether it be, you know, we around here call it the China Bill or something of that nature. The left seems to have this command and control model. We're going to find the things we find interesting, they like, and that's where they move the money. But as we've learned, it's the disruption that often isn't the most popular thing for getting grants or studies or even certain capital, that are often where the actual cure lies. So if we're going to do something like that where we're fixing the tax structure, the incentive structure, the capital gains structure, regulatory structure, and even the grants that are out there, you need to design it in a way where there's a reward for taking the risk and a bigger reward for taking the risk and having the cure. Instead of a model saying that you now have to fill out your grants and research the very thing that the bureaucrats are most interested in, instead of where the science takes you.
Do you think that Operation Warp Speed and the development of the COVID vaccine is a good example of sort of what you're talking about, a quick and radical, technological innovation that could help a lot of people?
Yeah, and there's some brilliant articles out there talking about Operation Warp Speed moved some of the messenger RNA technology up by about a decade. When you see even Tesla investing in the sort of, we'll call them biofoundry concept of, you have a disease, you have an illness, we can take part of your code, the disease's code, plug it in, and 48 hours later have a cure. You've just taken a substantial category of cancer, viruses, bacteria, other things your body may be suffering from, and turned it into functionally a software problem. It's a very different way to think about curing people, but much of our ailments, the solution now is almost the way you would approach a software solution. It's code.
It seems like solving these problems could be a way for America to sort of regain its footing internationally, to develop this IP, and semiconductors is one example of a thing where the U.S. used to develop 37% of semiconductors. Now it's down to 12%, and that's something that the China bill, which I'm not sure if you're.
No, look, the difference is what happens when a semiconductor functionally becomes a commodity, and there's sort of this longing for, hey, we want to be cutting edge, but explaining that's no longer cutting edge, that's a commodity product. There's massive new investments in Arizona, Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor. In Texas, you see a massive investment. It takes years to bring a fab out of the ground. And then there's this arrogance saying, well, if we set up this grant program, we're going to change, we're suddenly going to see all these new chips, and it doesn't work that way. And once again, it's getting a little uncomfortable, getting a little too close to sort of a planned economy. When you start hearing even some Democrats you thought were moderates sort of talking about the 5-year plan, the public-private partnership of this, and those are the very things that stop innovation in the long run. Remember, the DARPAs of the world do primary research, and then you allow it out, well, the civilian version of DARPA, and then you let the market go crazy of what they can innovate from that. Much of what we're seeing in some of this legislation, it would be from the concept all the way down to production, would have a government hand in it.
So you're saying that you are not going to support the China competition bill for that reason? But there's a number of things in there. I mean, it also is a slush fund for moving monies to things that aren't actually productive. It actually, if you wanted to compete with China and the rest of the world, fix the tax code. The fact of the matter is, when the rest of the world operates under a VAT, and yet when their products leave their shore, they're given back that, VAT tax. But when it hits our shores, we may have a small tariff, but they're given actually a tax arbitrage. When we send our product and it hits their shores, they put the VAT back on our products. There's a tax arbitrage in the world that's crushing U.S. exports. When the 4 ports on the West Coast will send back 7.1 million empty containers last year, there's something horribly wrong
and a bunch of government control, government subsidies, government mandates. How about fix first the tax code that's crushing us, and then bring our regulatory code into the modern era? Our current regulatory code is based almost on a 1938 model of fill out lots of paperwork, shove it in file cabinets, and that's how you're compliant. Instead of using crowdsourced data and other things, and I have whole presentations on that much faster and dramatically less expensive and much more accurate. It is fix the tax codes, fix the regulatory codes, and then we have to also start to fix our incentives to participate in the labor market.
What are some of those fixes to the tax code that you would like to see?
I actually think it's time we go into a deep dive and move forward on concepts like a border adjustability, where if much of the rest of the world we're competing with is using a value-added tax model, and they refund it to their exports, we're always going to have a 12 to 20 point tax arbitrage on our ability to export. It crushes US manufacturers. Now it makes it incentivize for you to go source your products from around the world and bring them into the country instead of manufacture the products here and send them out. So that one is one of the simplest. You also designed the tax code that it incentivizes taking types of risks that make us more productive. A simple way to think of this, you're not old enough. 1981, the last time we were in an inflationary cycle like this. You know, people always talk about Reagan moving Paul Volcker forward, they jacking up interest rates, and that's what stopped inflation. That's only part of it. In 1981, they also cut taxes in a way because they were trying to move up production. What is inflation? It's too many dollars chasing too few goods. You can do two things. You can raise interest rates in a way where you squeeze down the availability of dollars, but at the same time you also can tap down inflation by making more stuff, making more goods and services available. And that's sort of a supply side model of make more stuff, incentivize through the tax code, regulatory code, the way you do capital gains taxes, go make more stuff. And that actually also is a way you tap down inflation.
So you are mentioning the Reagan tax cuts, but they sort of started us on the path of debt a little bit. Debt increased from under $1 trillion before he took office to over $2.5 trillion after he took office, and it hasn't really toned down. Well,
actually, part of that is inaccurate when you say, but the size of the economy. So it was the debt to the size of the economy actually went our favor. And also remember, that was also some of the movement of where our demographics, had started to change. What I care about is not that $30 trillion number, it's the size of our economy and how much debt we're bouncing off of that. And that's the holy grail. It's, we're going to keep borrowing money. We have to grow. And just like they did in that part of the 80s, we grew at a rate that so many of, particularly left-wing economists, didn't think we could possibly do.
So the solution to debt is more economic growth. And
no, you see, that's back to what we were talking about before. It's you got to do everything. It's economic growth. It's disruption through technology on our healthcare costs. It's population dynamics, incentives to stay in the labor force. You have to do all these things. You need to do them all at once.
And you mentioned that for a lot of Americans, under 50 especially, that the excessive levels of debt are going to be very dangerous. You said you want your daughter to grow up in a prosperous world. I'm obviously, like you said, younger, closer in age to your daughter.
Yes, and I'm not resentful at all of your youth and your future. So.
And I think for a lot of younger people in my generation, one of the big issues in the future is climate change. Mm-hmm. And do you think there's a way for us to deal with the climate crisis while also dealing with this debt, or are we going to have to pick one or the other?
And one of the most frustrating things I have, and sorry, with a lot of young, but also on the left, is when there's disruptive technology that is amazing, and actually provides a path to really deal with, if you're someone who embraces certain climate change models, actually shows a path of a solution. If it's not part of either their folklore or who writes them checks, it's not embraced. I did actually a floor presentation a couple weeks ago showing that there's a new breakthrough on something that's very, very cheap, very, very simple. It was actually a type of altered clay. It's functionally a kitty litter that apparently has this amazing absorption of methane. It would be a dramatically less expensive way to go and capture methane. Methane is a 9-to-1 ratio, though it has a slightly different half-life than we used to believe. We now know how to do ambient carbon mining at prices that we never thought possible. There are technologies that are disrupting. So if climate change is what drives your political view, your soul, get much more creative on the technology. Instead, you have this sort of Malthusian movement, particularly on the environmental left, that says, well, we should live poorer and live less. And there's those of us who are incredibly optimistic of, the MIT technology from a couple of years ago, where they found a way to do ambient carbon capture at a fraction of the current cost. Grab those, push those, move those forward, and you actually see there is a solution where both the right and the left can get to the same point they want without bankrupting your generation.
And some of those are sort of what you said about reforming the tax code. There's 45Q in the tax code, which is...
I'm the sponsor of.
Yeah, so something like that, which is set to expire at the end of 2023. And then an extension for that, as well as Section 48, was part of Build Back Better, and is something that more moderate Democratic senators have said that they would support climate legislation. Do you think there is an opportunity, at least of that part, to have some sort of bipartisan agreement?
The answer is both yes, and we're not going far enough in our creativity. So one of the things I've tried to push, and 45Q is putting a value on incentivizing the beginning of the industry that learns how to craft carbon and sequester it. But we now see there's some amazing new, and this is all cutting edge stuff, new ways to grab that carbon and shove it in concrete, or shove it into a type of plastic, or shove it into building materials where it is sequestered for centuries. So it's not only, we've seen the breakthrough on how to capture. Now we need a version of the 45Q to also incentivize where to put it. And the 45Q that was always saying, okay, we'll capture lots of it and we'll shove it back in the ground and use it in enhanced oil recovery, fine. But it turns out if the direction of the technology is smaller, more compact, you can do it at more localized emitters. So over here you have a facility that's making concrete. The ability right there on site, because concrete is making it as a big emitter, capturing that CO2 and shove it right back into the concrete itself as it's poured into your neighborhood sidewalk. That's where the disruption needs to be. And it breaks my heart and just drives me insane around here that almost no one reads. There's amazing articles coming out about these technology breakthroughs, and we still sound like we're a decade out of date when we're doing legislation.
I think there's a side of environmentalists that are ignoring the carbon capture technology, and then there's a side that is optimistic but has some doubts, especially about ambient air capture. Even the people who are in favor of expanding carbon capture a lot worry that ambient air capture doesn't really have a market. There's no...
in some ways it doesn't, so that's actually part of what you're doing, particularly if you can do it at the point source. So I use the concrete because that's just an easy visual. But right there, you see there's a model that works and is being done in certain parts around the world. There's a couple places in Europe that have been doing it now for a year or two, and it seems to be working really well. But I'm going to ask you to take also a step backwards. So many of the policies of the current administration have been so bad. Some of the approaches on natural gas and the permitting and the regulations and the piping. The United States this year will use, what, about 17% more coal. We're now exporting lots of coal to Europe and other places around the world. So in 2021, the 1 year of left unified government, even if when you adjust for, economy coming back, we've made the world dirtier. And it's because we did things to push up the price of natural gas rather dramatically. And so we took our cleanest fuel that actually provides also the ability to do things like the Allen cycle, where you can burn natural gas, produce electricity, and capture every bit of the CO2. Instead of moving that direction, the Biden administration's attack sort of natural gas, we raised the price and we drove people back to using coal. It's like you wonder, do they have any economists that actually understand the technology opportunities and what happens when you raise the cost of our cleanest fuels?
So you mentioned sort of how natural gas can be burned without emitting carbon. A lot of that has to do with these carbon capture technologies.
Well, the ambient cycle, or excuse me, Allen cycle, the concept is, okay, you've blown up the gas, why not use that superheated gas to turn another part of the turbine, and at that point capture it? I mean, but that's just one. There's lots of other things. We have a fascination in the office of how to get plastic out of the ocean. There's lots of things we environmentally care about. Okay, 90% of the plastic in the world's oceans come from 10 rivers. Go to those, 8 are in Asia, 2 are in Africa. Go to the 10 rivers and incentivize the value of that plastic. Instead, you see lots of charities and groups, we're going to go out in the ocean and collect. Well, first thing you should do is go to the 10 rivers where you know the sources are. But the charity model, the people that make money on it, those aren't necessarily incentivized to actually go to the point sources. But it's a lot more manageable if you go to the 10 rivers, 8 in Asia, 2 in Africa, and that's where 90% of the world's ocean plastics come from. I'm struggling to get people to think with a calculator in their brain instead of think with their emotions, because that calculator in the brain will make the economy, opportunity, growth, and the environment much better, and do it in a way where it doesn't have to be sort of a Malthusian future of living poor.
So how in the US can we work on an energy policy that is going to cut emissions? Because at the current rate, emissions are going to continue increasing, and the damages from climate change are going to outpace the benefits.
Okay, I think there's something wrong in the model of your question. We were actually cutting emissions at the same time having economic growth. I accept there's a bunch of pandemic noise in the data sets, and we're always having to adjust for that. We need to also get the Democrats in this current model to stop their war on all types of hydrocarbons, because the base load is the need. I mean, think about what's going on right now in the Northeast with this cold snap. The amount of fuel oil that's being burnt in New York liberal constituencies. The very people that elect some of the hard left are now the dirtiest emitters in the United States. For those of us in the West, we actually have this weird thing of, in the afternoons, our power, if you actually look at the futures market, the price goes to zero. We're producing so much photovoltaic. At the same time, we also kept our baseload nuclear in Arizona. So what do you do with that excess power? We're working on a project there where much of that excess power is going to be turned into hydrogen, and hydrogen becomes a battery. So sort of these grid dynamics, and it's fascinating. I'll still get people that oppose the baseload nuclear. Well, take a look at the carbon impact of Germany right now. They got rid of their baseload nuclear, and they're dramatically dirtier than they were before. It's stopped letting sort of the emotional current environmental movements take the day and start doing the ones that actually are based on the facts and the math. And be willing to push that technology envelope. I mean, the iron air battery coming out of your part of the country you grew up in is, if it's true, we can do large utility grade batteries without rare earths, and it has, you know, a power cycle that's weeks. And the first ones will be rolled out, I think, by the end of this year at a utility grade. Some of the breakthrough is already here. Now, back to, like we were talking about 45Q, fix the tax code, fix the regulatory code, so there's a path for the disruptive technologies to become part of our everyday. And there's a perverse incentive around Capitol Hill that a lot of the groups that write checks, a lot of the groups that have technologies spend lots of time courting members of Congress, even when their technologies are already out of date.
And some would say that some of those technologies that are out of date are coal, fossil fuel.
I'm actually talking about certain types of photovoltaic, others where there's already been a leap beyond those. You look at some, like you talked, the Democrats' Build Back Better, which is really more of a social spending bill with lots of green expenditures in it. A lot of that money was actually going to technologies that have already been leaked. And that's my frustration. It's what happens when you do prescriptive spending, prescriptive committees that get to choose sending money to their friends. It's the same thing in the CHIPS Act or the China bill, those. You're empowering government to choose its friends instead of the technology that's most disruptive and effective to win.
So I think you're right that there is too much power from outside groups, industry groups, whether it could be fossil fuel groups, union groups, have a lot of power with PACs. Do you think there's a way for us to reform campaign finance laws to prevent this influence, this outside influence?
Actually, I don't actually believe it's on the campaign finance side. Because for a lot of these groups, it's not the check they write. It's maybe the populations they're able to deliver. I mean, to give you an idea, a great perversity, the infrastructure bill. Okay, so there's this piece of legislation, hey, they're touting we're gonna, it's gonna help the supply chain, even though only a fraction of the spending actually went to roads and bridges. And then they slip in language in there saying the ports can't automate. So you have a world where, being from the West, being from Arizona, we just had the first successful autonomous truck move goods with no driver, and dealing with, because we have this demographic trucker shortage and the concept of that automation. But because the union group at the pier was so powerful, the Democrats slipped in saying you can't automate. We're going to give you a bunch of money for some green things, but we won't let you adopt technology like Singapore and so much of the rest of the world to move these containers off more efficiently. Is that because of money? Is that because of, they deliver votes? My solution would be a much more, you don't drop a multi-thousand-page piece of legislation with hidden little things like that in it that no one finds out until 6 weeks later. In some ways, it's sunshine, it's information theory solves the problem. If the public knew what frauds were being put in these pieces of legislation, I think that would actually be the pressure point to stop the sort of special interest giveaways if they were exposed. And you and I had an earlier conversation. What you're doing is wonderful here. I think it's also why some of the floor speeches that you've been very kind to me putting up, where you're walking through the details, all of a sudden we're getting millions of people looking at it. There is a hunger for actual facts instead of just, sort of salacious, hyperbolic language. Instead, I think the public's ready to understand the scam that so many of these pieces of legislation are.
I think that people are interested in that, but one of the issues is that these salacious, like you were saying, comments are the ones that are attracting more attention. So how do we break through? And I think it's an issue on both sides where more inflammatory remarks are the ones that people are attracted to.
Well, and that's where that's different than the campaign finance side. There's a human nature side, and this one I don't have a good solution for. You become a member of Congress. You're willing to say crazy stuff. You're going to get boatloads of people go online and send you $50. We actually have a world right now that incentivizes disharmony. And it's not only at our level, it's take a look at what's on cable television. Cable television is about viewer retention, not about giving you news. The blogs you choose to log into, you're often looking for reaffirmation of your belief systems. What you watch on YouTube or Facebook is reaffirmation of your current belief system. You're not trying to get educated. You're trying to almost have people tell you what you know is right. And when someone says something that's outlandish but makes you get your emotions going, you send them money. This is more of a societal thing, and I don't have a brilliant solution because it's down to the public and what we consume as news-wise, what the media actually puts out as news to be able to survive economically, because it's a tough world out there. How many publications won't do certain types of articles because they're fearful of offending their base readership or their base subscribers or those things? So they stick with things that, keep them economically solvent. And I'm not sure what the solution there is. That's one of the reasons I've so focused on disruptive technology, because at this moment, no one has made it. Is that flu kazoo we talked about, is that Republican or Democrat? It's neither. It's technology. It's just disruptive. Now, eventually we'll take sides and we'll make it partisan. But for right now, what it is, it's hopeful that there is a path that makes our lives better, that actually takes on some of our biggest problems, particularly that debt.
Do you worry that in Congress, like you said, this flu kazoo could be made partisan? I think certain issues are made partisan. People will say, climate change is a Democratic issue, or immigration is a Republican issue. How do you bring these back so that Congress is debating them in a bipartisan manner?
Look, we often, I think, don't look at them almost through an economist lens. Like I talk about immigration a lot. I'm from Arizona. But one of the ways we try to talk about it is understand what are the two ways you make the working poor much poorer? Inflation, because much more of their income goes to that rent and that food and that fuel. So the inflation cycle we've had over the last 12 months is crushing the working poor. But the other thing the literature says, and this isn't Republican or Democrat, it's academic literature, it's the math, is when you put in a couple million people with similar skill sets. So if you're part of the working poor, what do you economically sell? Mostly your labor. You hang drywall, you do this or that, and then you flood the economy with people with similar skill sets. There's some great articles out there that talk about what you've just done is you've either devalued this population's labor or made it so the ability for them to raise the value of the labor they provide, they flatten out. So we can show you literature that says what's happened at the border this year, this last year, will make the working poor poorer for the next decade. It's just, but no one here is willing to sit and read the article that goes on and on and on and get to the punchline at the end saying the model says what we've done at the border, we're making poor people poor. And then you add inflation on top of that. If we would do the debates based on its actual math, its actual facts, is that Republican or Democrat? It's human, but it's also the facts. But immediately you'll get someone that's going to say, well, you don't like this population or you don't like that, and because that's easy and it's a cheap shot, because it avoids having to actually, there's no intellectual capital you have to expend on it.
And you mentioned that the demographics of the U.S. are sort of what's driving some of this debt, the rising population. Is there a way for immigration to fix those demographic problems and increase economic growth?
It does not fix it. It can have a benefit, particularly in the margins. One of the first things you have to do is you have to stop importing poverty. And I know that's uncomfortable, but think of the irony, and we don't have this number vetted, we're working on it, it's just the Biden administration is really crappy in making certain data available. But we think in the last year or two, we've had a couple million functionally illegal crossers, but also legal immigration may be down as much as 1.7 million. I mean, we're trying to vet that number. But if you look at the profile of legal immigration, these are people often with advanced skills, certain talents. These folks substantially have actually an economic plus side. They grow the economy. It's uncomfortable to talk about it, but it's the math. This population that crosses illegally actually end up becoming a GDP or economic burn. They require much more social services. They don't actually have advanced skills to deliver to the society. So if you focus on more of a talent-based immigration system and stop the importation of poverty, this causes growth. And that just becomes one of a multi-legged stool of the things you have to do for economic expansion. And the elegance of this, of a talent-based immigration system, I don't care about your gender. I don't care about your race. I don't care who you cuddle with. I don't care about your religion. We only as a society care about the talent you bring to our society. And this may be worth you looking at in the future. I have an argument that's saying, for the world, the battles over hydrocarbons or rare earths, that's in the past. I believe the future conflicts in the world will actually be over smart people. The entire world, other than part of sub-Saharan Africa, is in a fertility bust. Even China, the fertility bust. But there's a hunger for people with skills. And you're starting to see countries changing their immigration systems to get those smart people. And that's one of the things we're going to be competing with in the coming decades.
So how can we incentivize people with talent to come to the U.S.? Because a lot of people who want to and have these skills are faced with a very bureaucratic immigration process that can take years to get in.
If first you have to lock down the southern border, and the reason is the society, United States society, is not going to trust us saying we want these talented folks to come in. Oh, by the same time, you have a couple million crossing illegally. You have to demonstrate you're taking population dynamics of the United States seriously. And you can't just do this without taking care of that. It's just, that's unfair. And then you start to look at what are society's needs. In my community, I have one of the largest university in the United States, and I hear over and over, I actually had this conversation last month, a young man doing, I think, a PhD in quant from Ireland, but he's going to have to go back to Europe instead of being able to stay in Arizona. That's insane. We spend our resources to help this brilliant young man get his PhD in something we actually need. And our immigration system functionally says, well, we're so sluggish. And then if it's true, then under the Biden administration, because so much of the State Department and those things functionally shut down over COVID. We're, a year or so behind just processing the folks we wanted. Back to technology. My argument has always been there's a much more technology way to process and the weeding out of the talents we want compared to those that, how do you move the State Department into this century technology-wise for immigration enforcement?
And what are so you're saying technology, automation maybe, what are the other ways that we could move this forward so people aren't stuck, having to go back home after completing a PhD in the US?
It's the way we do sponsorships, but I also am a believer that, like in the H1, there's also some technology ways where we can find out when certain businesses are scamming the system. Saying, hey, we needed this type of computer programmer, we couldn't find one. Our ability to say, did they properly advertise? Did they really look? Were they actually paying market rates? And there's actually some who've talked about that part of that system the enforcement of that could be made much more elegant instead of almost a paperwork complaint system as we have today.
And what about Americans who have been here since they were 2 or 3 who might have come to the US illegally, not by choice? How can we make sure these Americans are granted citizenship?
Well, going directly to granting citizenship, I think, is a bit of a leap until you meet the societal, I think, obligation of we have secured the border, so we're not creating incentives for the next wave to come across the border. I mean, look, people are rational beings, and I believe there are rational actors everywhere in the world. If you have an administration that looks like they put out the welcome mat, it was rational that we'd have multiple millions cross our border. So you want to deal with the issue of populations that are already here, and you're going to ask American society saying, accept these folks into much more of the economic mainstream of the United States. Oh, by the way, you're still leaving your border open. Take care of that, and then I think actually this becomes a much easier problem for folks to work through. But you got to do one before the other, and accept that when you have an administration that's made so many tactical errors in regards to population dynamics and immigration and illegal immigration, no one here trusts them, and Democrats don't trust them either.
So you don't think there is a path for citizenship for Dreamers until
you lock down the border, and there's a reason for that. And I know that may not seem fair, but let's say you started that process of, hey, we're going to do these incentives and we're going to give out citizenship. You don't think that creates the incentives for another wave?
I think the main issue would be that there are people who have been in the U.S. for 20 years and
I'm not arguing the merits, but I am arguing the second degree and third degree effects.
Right.
So if you can actually take care of those concentric circles of the effects, this policy set becomes actually quite easy.
Is there a way to do them in conjunction rather than, because policy takes a while to...
We tried, and the answer is no. I've grown much more cynical about this. And look, I'm incredibly sensitive to what we used to call dreamers, being from Arizona. But if you're going to do a global solution, it's got to be global. And what we find, particularly here in Congress, folks want to pander to one sympathetic population without dealing with the big problem that is, I mean, I did a police ride-along a couple of weeks ago. The amount of homelessness, fentanyl, drugs, and other things that are the second-degree effect of what's happening on my southern border. The human misery I was seeing in some of my neighborhoods. We talk about populations presenting themselves at the border, but we almost avoid the discussion of how many lives are being lost and the misery and the price of drugs crashing this last year because that border's open. So deal with this, and this doesn't have to take a long time. I mean, we were well on our way. Look at our, illegal crossing dynamics a year ago. And to get back there, I think actually makes now dealing with everything else much easier.
So I want to sort of pivot a little bit to politics and the upcoming elections. Some Republican lawmakers, especially governors, have said that Donald Trump shouldn't be the nominee in 2024. Would you support Donald Trump if he was running in the primary?
I think actually, and Arizona being one of the later primary states, I think you let the, particularly the Republicans, choose. Look, Tim Scott's one of my, favorite people. He and I served together. I've been trying to talk Tim into running, but he's also my buddy. We're friends, we're cohorts. But ultimately, those of us in the political class should probably shut our mouths and let the public choose. And those of us with the gray hair probably will get to sort of sit back and see what people in your generation and those who are the voters actually bring us.
So you wouldn't want to make a determination until after the primaries are...
Well, you let the process begin. Also, I accept I may have a slightly more disruptive view of what government should not be doing. And I would love to see that become part of the discussion, because we are seeing some really interesting polling dynamics out there where a lot of particularly independents have buyer's regret, buyer's remorse. And understanding that, we just finished a calculation, and I think we're up to about $67,000 has been spent per person in pandemic relief. And the crazy thing is, by the end of the year, if working poor will actually be poor. The middle class will actually be poor, even though we've spent that type of money. And it's a demonstration of the arrogance of Washington and how badly they do basic economics. Will you get someone running for president that actually speaks to how things really work in a positive fashion? Or will it be more sort of the, people still being in their sort of rhetorical silos as everyone is right now?
And you mentioned Tim Scott. Is that someone that you would want to see run? Is there anyone else that you would like to see run?
Well, Tim's my friend, so that he's just one I throw out. But we'll see. We'll watch and see. Remember, the one thing about politics is everything you and I know right now will be wrong 6 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm. And what about sort of more local politics? Kristen Sinema there's some speculation maybe she would run as an independent, as she's more popular with Republicans than Democrats now. Do you think that you would end up supporting her? Do you think you would make an endorsement for someone in that race?
Probably not. But Senator Sinema's race isn't for 3 years. The world will look very different 3 years from now. But almost just, and this is not a criticism, you and I have just sort of entered back into the Washington bubble talk. When we're speculating on a Senate race that's 3 years from now, it makes great sort of over coffee gossip, but it's not real. In some ways, it's just a filler, because the real stuff is, it makes your mind bleed. And that's one of my great disdains for Washington, is how much the lips move around here and how much none of it really means anything.
And you said sort of those setting your mind on fire. What are some of the things that you wish you could get through to your colleagues that would set their mind on fire, that maybe they haven't realized?
It's very simple. How dangerous the debt is, how fast it's moving, and the path to prosperity, and to manage that debt. That window is closing every single day we don't do things, and that's in some ways the benchmark of what I speak to. And And it's your generation, my daughter, and people who are heading to retirement in the next few years are the ones who are going to get crushed. But we chase today's shiny object instead of the avalanche that's coming down the mountain towards us.
So in 2022, if Republicans take back the House, maybe the Senate, and obviously President Biden will still be in office, is there a way in that time period for the government to start handling this? Is there maybe a bipartisan path? Is there a way to get people on board with tackling this
There's
issue?
always a way. But you'd actually have to have a number of my brothers and sisters on the left. And I'm going to sound like a jerk when I say this, but accept math. It's one of my intense frustrations is, and what I'm going to say is going to seem a little unfair, but I think I can back it up. There is a cultural difference between those of us on the right and the left. And so many of my Democrat friends, and they'll almost admit this, they're judged by their intentions. The quality of the virtue signaling compared to the success or the outcome. And if you're incentivized to push policies or concepts or spending or regulations because it has a great title, it feels good, it sounds good, even though every data point says it will make people poor, it will slow the growth of the economy, the society's opportunities. It's hard to have that compromise. You know, people often say, this is going to sound a little bit like a heretic. People say, well, why can't you just compromise? Let's split the loaf in half. How about if the loaf itself is rotten? If the underlying concept actually doesn't work? So that's why my love of sort of disruptive technologies is go around the problem. During the age of Dodd-Frank, and I know I'm skipping around, but I'm trying to use this as an example, there was this war here of massive regulation, less regulation. And my argument was that you're both missing the point. What makes a banking institution stable? Capital. An institution that holds a certain amount of equity capital, regulate them less. Because that was the benchmark of stability, not armies of regulators being more or less. And it's a different way to think is, we want to have the fight over this when the actual solution was going around it.
And what are some other areas? I mean, we've talked about climate change a little bit. That seems like an area that could be ripe for this sort of solution where you are going around the problem or not. You know, there's the let the free market decide, there's pour money into certain things.
Actually, in some ways, it's beyond just a market. It's also the speed technology disruption's coming.
And, I mean, you've mentioned that carbon capture is a technology that most environmental models do incorporate carbon capture technology.
Actually, I'm going to disagree with you. Most of the models I've seen, and I've spent, my binder sitting over there going over them, almost no credit for that.
The good ones put in about 10, it's like 10 gigatons of CO2 capture by 2050.
Please send me that. I'd love to see someone, because I have a couple of them you can even run on your MacBook over there. And it's sort of fun. It's also fun how often you get these updates saying, oh, we just recalculated, we didn't realize the half-life of methane is 9 years and not 15 years. So you and I also have to accept that much of what we model is living. It's changing as we get new technologies or new data sets. But the real disruptions, I actually think, come in other places. They come in the sharing economy. They come in the crowdsourced economy. They come in healthcare. And in a weird way, those all will have a cascade effect. Can I throw a concept at you, just for the fun of it? And I actually did a YouTube video. I had someone do a cartoon on this a couple of years ago, could get no one interested in it. So you have that phone in your pocket. Yeah, that little supercomputer.
Yep.
There's things you can attach to that phone today that will do air quality samples. There's ones that'll do volatile organics, hydrocarbons, PM10, PM8. So for the county you grew up in, my Maricopa County, if you had a few thousand people walking around with sensors attached to the UPS truck or clipped to your lapel or on your phone, you could have tens of thousands of data points every day. You could have a crowdsourced air quality monitoring system. If you had that, do you still need a permitting process? Because if you're the motorcycle paint shop, right now you have to fill out paperwork, you have to bring in someone to certify your air quality scrubbers. Every so often you have to bring in an engineer to do this, then you have to fill out more paperwork. But in a crowdsourced model, the first time you screw up, we catch you. Society catches you, and all of a sudden the bureaucracy that today shoves paper in file cabinets, actually, because file cabinets full of paper don't make air quality better. You hop probably in your electric car over to where the point source problem is. So think of that. It's a crowdsourced model for air quality regulation. You could do the same thing for water, for sound, for so many other things, for financial markets. Much less bureaucratic, lowers the barriers of entry for someone wanting to start a business. And everything we've ever seen, it would actually, in that air quality model, make the air quality dramatically better, because you catch the clowns that are painting cars in their backyard. That today's regulatory model, where it's you fill out your paperwork, they're never the ones who are going to be part of the regulatory model. That's an example of using crowdsourced data. So am I starting making sense that there's these opportunities out there to move away from the sort of 1938 regulatory model, lower everyone's societal cost of that regulation, but get dramatically more benefit from it?
So how do we get people on board? I think some people might be concerned, if I'm providing this data to the government, I'm being tracked, there's data privacy concerns.
Everyone that ever says that, this is going to be a little nasty, they don't understand data. There's so many ways to anonymize data, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in your medical records, whether it be in that crowdsourcing, and that would be purely voluntary. The person that sits outside, their ex-wife's motorcycle paint shop and blows cigarette smoke into the sensor, well, the fact of the matter, that's in the tail. The model easily just discounts that. All those things are thought through. The biggest barrier is the incumbency model. I'm an environmental engineer. I sell my services to those motorcycle paint shops to once a year come by and give them my stamp that I check their equipment. That person lobbies against a disruptive crowdsourced model that the bureaucrats at the county air quality regulator don't like a crowdsourced model because it just changed all their jobs or eliminated their jobs. That's the barrier. It's actually not fragility in the technology. It's the fragility in taking on the current bureaucracy. It likes the way it is, because their number one goal is to get their pension, and the business bureaucracy that says, hey, we make our living at this. We don't want to become Blockbuster Video.
I think a lot of people might be upset with the pace at which Congress moves.
As it should be.
You're proposing sort of these changes that, like you said, the incumbency model, and that applies for Congress too, might not be interested in pursuing. So what are the ways to incentivize Congress to take action other than
one of the things we've done is a simple example. We have a piece of legislation to extend the expansion of telehealth. When the pandemic is declared over, you could still have your access to telehealth, which goes away. My legislation that expanded that. Within there, we've tried to put in language saying, hey, you could also, the definition of telehealth is what the FDA has said meets meets a certification standard, because we do have some algorithms that the FDA has certified. Diabetes pump, your ability to use that, your sensor, the pump, your phone, That's an example of an algorithm that's helping you manage your blood glucose. So back to my flu kazoo, if you could legalize that technology, now the next level is you're also going to have to find states that are willing to deal with their state licensure issues. But there'll be some states out there that are willing to take a flyer at looking to what, and it's not the future. I mean, this technology is here today. We just have regulatory and reimbursement barriers to it. So my approach has always been, don't be prescriptive. Just say, if this type of technology meets the safety and efficient and standards, let the technology fly. And I think you and I will all be surprised what that technology is. We have a running joke in my family. What are the 2 times in life you think you know everything? When you're 13 years old and the day after you get elected to Congress. And the reason we use that as a joke is you got a lot of people here that are very smart, but everything they know is now a decade out of date. And they're still fighting for that. I read like 5 hours a night of just crazy stuff. And sometimes you see there's these little gems of where the future is going to take us if I can get Congress out of the way.
And you mentioned that innovation might be easier in states at the state level where it's perhaps a little more nimble. Are there any states that you see doing something, whether it be Arizona, whether it be a different state, that's doing something in innovation that Congress should maybe take a look at and embrace?
In some ways, it's not Congress looking at the states. In some ways, it's Congress stop trying to control everything out of Washington. And I have a great interest in blockchain. I've done lots of work. So everyone hears the word blockchain, they immediately think cryptocurrencies. And I actually think blockchain because it can protect your privacy, but you get to see who's looking at you. It's absolutely bulletproof when properly designed. So it actually has some really neat possibilities. In states like Arizona, we've set up a blockchain sandbox, so you can sort of set up and experiment with the technology without getting litigated out of business. I think I saw Iowa doing something very similar, Massachusetts. Those are hopeful signs. I think they need to go further, but from the federal level, we control so much of the money, and that becomes part of the problem. It's always about the money. And if we allow the money to flow to where it does good things instead of flow to what we like or who supports us politically, it makes it much easier for the states to be innovative.
I sort of on a different topic here, but I wanted to ask, you've spoken about being adopted and how that's influenced your view of family life, and you've also been to a couple marches for life. I was wondering, it seems likely that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. What do you think the political impacts of that are going to be?
Never, ever try to second guess the Supreme Court. But, sitting right next to us, the greatest gift I've ever had in my life. My wife and I spent years and years and years trying to adopt. And she's 3rd generation adopted. So I was born in an unwed mother's home, back when they used to have those. My brother, my sister, my father was too. And now my wife and I, we're both 59 and we have a 6-year-old. So we're pathologically optimistic. It is the most fun I've ever had in my life. And I have a photo, I think, over there that actually has my sister and her birth family, and my brother and a little bit of his birth family, and myself and my birth family. We all went to Disneyland. And it's this big crowd, and you start to realize the definition of what is family is very different today than it was 3 decades ago. I mean, you know, if you take a look at the family photo, there's all sorts of different races and you know, different groups and this and that, and still it's all love. And what I'm hoping is the whole discussion of what is family, what is life, what is government's place in this, that those of us who are pro-life are approaching it from a hopeful, optimistic standpoint that maybe the biases, the prejudices of past decades are gone. And now it's the love of life and understanding sometimes life is brutal, it's tough. And we all struggle like crazy to have it. So we'll see. It will have some interesting ramifications at state levels and community levels, and but we'll see. I've been shocked how kind people, even people who are not where I am ideologically on the subject, you know, also being from a conservative Catholic family, but they've been always very kind to me because I think they understand how personal it is.
And do you see, you know, any efforts to sort of establish like similar rights to Roe v. Wade for abortion in Congress, or do you think that after the Supreme Court decides that's going to be the end of it?
But the nature of your question, I think actually what's in front of the court is there really a federal nexus, or is it truly a state issue?
And so you think that it's more likely it'll just be down to the states, and certain states will...
Look, I'm a finance guy, I'm not a lawyer. But my understanding is, from a constitutional mechanic, that's what's being argued.
Gotcha. And so, I think I'm kind of running out of questions here.
Look, I appreciate you doing this. It's, I know this is sort of the first one.
Yeah.
And I know we've gone really detailed into some geeky stuff. But what you're doing is actually incredibly important. You're one of the few publications that actually, I think, your viewership, your listenership, your readership is, let's be honest, intellectually several tiers above, you know, the commonality of what a lot of us pander to. But that's actually where the solutions are. I hate to admit it, but I'm going to quote my father. My father as a kid used to say, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution. That's absolutely wrong. And the reality, particularly here in Washington, complex problems often require complex solutions. You've asked more about complex stuff than I've had anyone talk to me in a couple of years about.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to get to the root of these issues. As you're saying, you know, you're presenting that we have these massive issues, and I think debt is one of them. I would say climate change is one of our biggest issues. The cost of healthcare.
But on all of them, you got to be optimistic. There are paths that work, that don't wipe out the economy, don't wipe out your economic future, that actually take on the issues. But it will require very different thinking from members of Congress, people in the bureaucracy, and I hate to say this, people in your media.
Do you think that you know, Congress and especially the Senate skews older? Do you think that there's an opportunity for younger people to bring in those more innovative ideas into Congress?
You're not going to like what I'm about to say. I've been shocked how many young people I meet that are almost monochromatic in their thinking. They had a liberal teacher, a liberal professor, a liberal. They've never actually gone through this sort of think disruptively, think optimistically. What actually is the problem? And is it a bureaucratic, regulated government model, or is there another way? Diabetes is my classic. I will get rooms full of people here that want to spend hours discussing putting up more diabetic clinics and doing this and doing that. And our argument is, we now know how to cure type 1. Do everything you can to find a path to take on type 2. Now it means changing nutrition support, the farm legislation, Medicaid systems around the country. You're probably going to have to do healthcare bonds if the procedure is expensive. But the cure is the disruption, not a better way to live with the misery. That is not ageist. That's not a young person, that's not an old person. That's those who have developed a different discipline in how they think. And
I mean, again, we're getting back to the fact that it's a different type of thinking that is not really in Congress at the moment.
Yeah, it sometimes gets really lonely around here.
Do you have, is there a coalition of members that you think are working on these ideas and that you think could maybe make a breakthrough in Congress?
You're catching me on a cranky day on that question. I did a presentation to a couple members last week on some of the healthcare technology disruptions that really could lower the cost of healthcare. And at the same, you see, there's PCR COVID tests you can have at home now. This concept of your medicine cabinet is a medical lab in today's technology, and it's cheap. These are all very smart. 2 were medical doctors. And you could see how uncomfortable they were, because the first thought was, what disruption does this do to my community, my political support? It's really good. They understood it was really good for the future. But sometimes what's good for your future, my child's future, may not be necessarily great for your next election. And in a weird way, that's part of my battle, is the willingness to talk about the massive economic shortfalls in Medicare. Lots of members here understand how bad the math is, and they will never speak it, because to explain that to their voters is often to court disharmony. And because a lot of folks don't want to hear this because they've been lied to for so long about what the actual math is. So my answer is not particularly, if I have one thing that makes this all very difficult, is how do you get members of Congress and theirs. Now where we are making progress is the staff. A lot of the floor speeches I do, I'm actually not talking to members of Congress, not even my voters at home. I'm partially talking to the staff here, which are sitting in their offices, watching and doing their work, and trying to help them think that there are actual solutions to the problems instead of ways just to pave over them.
I think we're about to wrap up here, but if you think, if you could give one message, maybe this time not to staffers or your constituents, but maybe to people who are watching, what they should take away from your message, and what they should what they could maybe do to help,
If there's someone watching and they've made it this far, all the way to the end, I should buy you a cup of coffee, but they're also someone that actually cares. Someone that's been willing to watch all the way through this. You're already self-selected as a unique individual. And I'm hoping the optimism that there are fixes. We just have to push those in the political class, the bureaucratic class, the press class, to be willing to hear that there's a different approach. And for all of us, when you write a letter to your state legislator or your congressman, think a little more in depth, instead of sounding like so many of us do, where we're a decade out of date of where the world really is. Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks.